One of the things I hear thought leaders ask for most is more time. More time to do the many things that they feel called and inspired to do, but especially more time to think. Because somehow it's that thinking, clear, productive, effective thinking, that makes it possible to do more with less time. So, if more time to think is what you're after, this episode of Books for Thought Leaders is for you. If you're new here, welcome to the Yazzie Media YouTube channel, where we empower thought leaders, experts, entrepreneurs, and enthusiasts to share their visionary message with the impact they desire and the income they so richly deserve. Now, More Time to Think, A Way of Being in the World by Nancy Kline is a book that has literally started a movement. And this is remarkable when you think that the origin of this book was in the rather humble and modest zone and realm of education. But from there, it has gone on to influence leaders at every level, not only in corporations and organizations, but even presidents and leaders of nations. Now, if it can do that for them, and the stories shared in this book really show that it's true, imagine what it can do for you in the work that you do, in your thought leadership, in your day-to-day life, and even your lasting impact and legacy in the world. Well, the principle or the premise of more time to think is really that there are certain conditions, or what Nancy Kline, the author, calls components of the thinking environment. And although those principles have been with us since time immemorial, they actually combine to create something that is revolutionary and cutting edge. And what struck me as I was reading the book was that I actually was doing a rereading out loud alongside someone that I consider one of the best listeners I have ever come across in my life. Someone who is a natural teacher, a natural coach, and who sometimes has a problem that when she invites people over, they simply won't leave because they just bask in her presence and what she draws out of them. And most specifically, the way she helps them to think so clearly. Now, she would never been invited or exposed to the more time to think environment, or the thinking environment, as it's called before. And it was a first reading of the book for her. But as I was reading alongside her, I realized that these are components, these 10 components of the thinking environment are things that she has nurtured and expressed and embodied over a lifetime. And that is the reason why people think so well in her presence. I'm sure that when you truly listen to people, you've experienced that they walk away going, "Thank you so much for your advice. It's been brilliant." And you realize that you hadn't given them a word of advice. You'd simply listened and been there for them, and perhaps asked the right questions. Now, more time to think really helps to isolate what those points are. And I'm intrigued to see how they actually make a difference. When I think of situations where people have thought clearly, myself and people that I've mentored, taught, and coached, and even anecdotal evidence from people who have made big breakthroughs, as well as the studies done on thinking and even intelligence over time, I see that these 10 components of the thinking environment have been present. And so, just for those 10 components, the book would be worthwhile. And the copy that I have with me is a bit of an older edition, but it's still absolute solid gold. And by the way, the best way to actually tackle a book like this, especially because of the author's very unique and comforting and supportive and nurturing approach, is to both have the hard copy that you can really refer back to, but also, especially if you're the kind of person who needs more time to think, if you catch my drift, you might enjoy the audiobook. The audiobook that is available on Audible is absolutely enriching and supporting and thought-provoking. And it's read by the author herself, Nancy Kline, whose way of expressing herself is just so beautiful. It comes across beautifully in her book. And if you look at her writing or her self-written bio as an author, that actually shows how she breathes these beautiful and exquisitely crafted words into life. And being part of that, being in the thinking environment that she creates, not only through the written book, but through the audiobook, is really amazing. So if you get this book, go for it, but start with the audiobook. I'd strongly recommend that. And then get yourself a copy. The great thing about that is that you can get the audiobook right away with an instant download, and you can then wait for the physical book to be delivered. Kindle is also great, but this is the kind of book that you want to be able to have in your hand on your desk when you need it and just refer back to. And yeah, take my warning, you might want more than one copy. The one that I have here is one that was kind of handed down, and it's the kind of book that you'll be wanting to give away and share with the people in your life who really need that thinking environment. But back to the book. It's divided into four parts that introduce this thinking environment, but also then frame how to use it. So, part one is called In Theory, and it introduces these 10 components of the thinking environment. But what's beautiful is the fact that every component of the thinking environment is not introduced with its name. It's introduced with a question. And that question embodies what the author Nancy Kline calls a deep, incisive question. Deep, incisive questions are the ones that really help us to probe the parameters, the borders, the farthest reaches of where our thought has gone before and break through to a new level of thinking. And the way that she models this throughout the book is just profound. So every book chapter's title is actually a question. So part one is In Theory, and it introduces these 10 components of the thinking environment. And I've debated whether I should share them here in the video. For many reasons, it's really worth diving into the book to go to explore that, because Nancy Kline introduces them so beautifully and eloquently. And there's a story attached to each one that brings so much clarity and insight that you're going to remember the stories, even if you don't remember the 10 components. But to show you just how valuable these components are, I'm going to share them here and just talk you through them very briefly. Not even, just give you the name and you'll understand how, when you've experienced that, you think more clearly. And imagine how these principles of the thinking environment in More Time to Think can help to liberate your own thought when you're thinking on your own, but also working in thinking partnerships or perhaps with a coach. If you are a coach or a mentor or a teacher of any kind, or of course, a leader, you will find that these principles prove valuable not only with yourself, but especially with those that you lead and teach and coach and mentor. So here are those 10 points very briefly. The first is attention, and full attention, where people know they have the space and the time to think, and they will not be interrupted. In fact, Nancy Kline's next book is about the promise that you will not be interrupted, and I'll add a link to that in the description to the video. The next is equality, and true equality. And how interesting is this when we think about especially leadership? Can we empower the people we work with to truly be leaders of their own? even if we are supposedly their leaders in a different context. But the thinking environment presupposes equality. And what's fascinating about that is that when you lead in this way, with that attitude, you actually are doing what my partner and mentor in leadership, Ian Hatton of the Totally Morpheus channel here on YouTube, proclaims, and that is to raise up leaders. And when you really think about that, a true leader does not lead followers. A true leader raises up leaders. And this approach of equality fosters that thinking. Imagine what that is worth in the environment where you lead. The next is ease. And what a beautiful approach to thinking rather than getting all tensed up, really having an open and ease-driven response to our thinking. Imagine what that can do. We all know we don't think when we're tense. We think when there is ease. Another property or a component of the thinking environment is appreciation. And this appreciation extends very, very far, not only inside the thinking environment, but also beyond this. So, truly something to really look into, appreciating each person and appreciating the contribution that they bring. Imagine how that fosters better quality thinking. The next component is encouragement. Another thing that we are often taught out of, aren't we? We're indoctrinated not to think. How many schools actually have that spirit of encouraging you to think freely, no matter where it goes? I remember when I was in high school, one of my prescribed textbooks was the incredible book Circles in a Forest by Dalene Matthee, a South African author who puts the whole matter of thinking for yourself into the context of a story that unfolds with the most riveting and heart-wrenching beauty, but also the awareness of what it is to think for yourself or to be denied that right, and how society tends to take that away from us, especially in unequal societies. And ironically, my approach to that book, being a teenager, was challenging my teacher when she set a certain assignment about the book with an assignment that colored far outside the lines. And when the teacher questioned this, bless her heart, my response was, but isn't the book all about thinking for yourself? I'll leave the link to Circles in a Forest in the description to this video as well. If you want to explore the thinking environment through a fictitious embroilment that takes you far beyond the thought that you are aware of and into deep, deep into a story, that is a great way to do it. But yes, encouragement is one of the things that we are scared to do, because when we say to people, especially teenagers like myself in that story, I want you to think for yourself. Are you ready to face what ensues? My poor teacher, I'm not quite sure how she dealt with it. But of course, there are consequences to thinking for yourself. And while I certainly passed the test of the thought experiment, I might not have reflected that in the grade that I got. Feelings are the next component of the thinking environment. And how interesting that we tend, especially in our modern society, to separate thinking from feeling. But could it be that feelings could be a whole new key to understanding the depth of what is possible with our thinking? What More Time to Think challenges us to do is really to use those feelings rather than sweeping them under the rug, but also to foster that environment for clear thinking, also beyond our feelings. The next is information. And of course, we need the right information to do clear and productive and effective thinking. What's interesting about this is that sometimes we do not have all the information. But what is powerful about this is looking into what a growing, dynamic, organic thinking can be, even when we don't have all the information, which, let's face it, to be perfectly honest, in most situations, we don't actually know, do we, ultimately, what the outcomes are. And many situations are so dynamic or agile, as we call it in the workplace nowadays, that we do need to be able to deal even when we don't have all the information. But more time to think places that component of the thinking environment in a very powerful light. Then there is difference, and difference has become something that is such a source of celebration, both in the world today, where we see the value of diversity across the world, within our workplaces, within our families, even, and within our communities, because divergence brings different perspectives and it can enrich if we are ready to embrace it. So the discussion there is really about more around this. And then there is the very, very powerful tool of incisive questions. When I was a young teacher, I became aware very quickly of how important it is to ask the right questions. When you stand at the front of a classroom and you ask a group of very eager young children, who, in my case, I was blessed to have a very obedient classes teaching in Asia, they would be very eager to please. But the answer to a question that is closed could very easily just become yes or no, or I don't know. Whereas asking powerful, incisive questions is really an art that can elevate the thinking of the person you are speaking to. And in the thinking environment, that is one of the most powerful components. And that is why every chapter in this book begins with a question, and that is the heading of the chapter. Another thing that comes to mind with incisive questions is the incredible book that made a big dent in the universe by the name of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Now, if you have read that classic, you'll know that diving into questions is a tremendously powerful part of quality that is really the ultimate philosophy behind Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and the other books by Robert M. Pirsig that have gone on to span such a powerfully impactful span of his life. If you move on from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance to Lila, an inquiry into morals, that then also begins to really see where does that thinking go after what was once a cult classic becomes a celebrated and respected and acknowledged classic in modern literature. So the links to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila, an inquiry into morals, both by Robert M. Pirsig, are also included here because they are semi-autobiographical fiction that is really diving into this concept of questions and incisive questions. Now, the 10th component of the thinking environment is place. And the story that Nancy Kline tells around this was one that really resonated with me because it comes from her own days as a teacher. And my own time as a teacher really taught me how much place and environment can do for teaching. And yet, it's not only the fancy trappings or the decor and the high budget doodads that we can add to an environment. It's so much more about creating that environment. But a component that Nancy Kline brought out in More Time to Think after her first book, Time to Think, is specifically that place also includes the place and space of our bodies that we occupy. And the longer I live, and if you have lived long enough to understand that your body and your space in the world becomes a vital component of your ability to think and function and perform and succeed in life, um, the more I live, the more I realize how important taking care of my body as a vehicle for my mind and ultimately the vehicle for any success that I have in the world. It is vital. And the combination of both physical space and our physical embodied space is one that Nancy Kline also explores with such beauty and grace in this book. So that is part one in theory. Part two is in practice, and here she gives advice specifically on using the thinking environment in pairs and then in groups. Part three of the book is about in progress, and this is where the newer developments come out. And finally, in the end, which is part four. But in addition to all of this, More Time to Think then also includes some very, very valuable appendices, bibliography that really does give you a lot to think about. And also some research on the thinking environment, which is a growing work in progress. And so, More Time to Think, A Way of Being in the World by Nancy Kline really is a holiday for your mind that will enrich you no end. If a holiday is really what you need, but right now the time for it isn't there, I challenge you to go and read or listen to More Time to Think, A New Way or A Way of Being in the World by Nancy Kline, and see how it creates those pockets of time that may well very soon give you the effectiveness of thought and buy you the extra time, create that extra time to do go and have that holiday, that getaway, that sabbatical, that true time for you to be and do your great work in the world. If you have read More Time to Think by Nancy Kline, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you're a More Time to Think coach, it would also be wonderful to learn more about you. I'd love to hear from you. Please do share in the comments here so that people who are interested can learn more about how they can take this experience further with a Time to Think coach and with the other processes that are available from Nancy Kline and what has become an empire of Time to Think. It really is a movement that deserves your attention wherever you're at as a thought leader, whether you are mentoring one person, leading hundreds, thousands, millions, or even very simply leading yourself. This principle and the 10 components of the thinking environment are ones that will nourish you and enrich you and take your thinking that much further. All the links are in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.